Hi and welcome. Just want to go through a few introductory topics for this upcoming pharmacology course. My name is Chad Peterson, and I'm going to be co-teaching this with Katrina, so you're going to get a few different lectures from me throughout the semester. So who am I? I'm a pharmacist. I work at Abbott Northwestern Hospital, and I have been working there for about 4 or 5 years. I graduated from the University of Minnesota with my degree in pharmacy, and before that I went to Bethel and I graduated with a chemistry degree. Let's see, anything else you want to know about me? I'm married, and this is a picture of my wife and my son Elliot. He's 15 months. And I'm interested in all types of different areas of pharmacy. For the most part, I work as a clinical pharmacist in the emergency department at Abbott, but we see a lot of different stuff at Abbott, anything from mental health to critical care to we have, of course, a big mother-baby center too that we support as well for their medication management. So I kind of consider myself somewhat of a general practitioner. As far as within the world of pharmacy, there's not really one area that I'm a specialist in. The other thing I do is I teach pharmacology to physician's assistant students at Bethel. So I teach the 3-semester pharmacology course as part of that curriculum. And that's kind of how I got hooked up with this job here. So without further ado, I'll go through a little bit of background information, then we'll talk about some regulatory stuff. Katrina has a lecture that goes through the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics stuff pretty well. And I'm going to refer back to those things a lot, things like half-life and bioavailability and stuff like that as we talk about different drugs. So it is important to watch that lecture, and that will be information that will come in handy in the future. So what am I going to be doing and what's Katrina going to be doing? Well, I'm going to be doing some lecturing. You'll probably get a few more recorded lectures from me than Katrina, and it's mostly just content. So I'm going to be giving you my sort of expertise as a pharmacist and what I think is important. And I'm going to be doing some of the exam writing too, in addition to probably some other random things as well. But one thing to remember is that as a lecturer, a lot of my content is coming from the physician's assistant program that I've put together. So a lot of it is geared towards that group. And I think you guys have a pretty similar role. You're both considered that advanced practice provider category. So I'm going to be going into detail on things that may or may not be as relevant to you guys in your practice, but I'll try and bring it back and touch base on some things that I also wouldn't necessarily cover for them. So I'm going to try and tailor some of my information that way. If there's stuff that you think I'm missing or concepts you're like, hey, we really want to learn more about this, or you could not really talk about this as much. If there's stuff that you just think that I could improve upon, I'd be more than willing to do that. I'm not. My other course is all face-to-face, so this is really the first time I've been doing anything online and recorded like this. So again, I'm open to feedback and feel free to email me. I don't think I have my email on the first slide, but if you want to email me, my email, I think it's attached to the course Moodle site, but it is petcha@bethel.edu. Once again, that's petcha@bethel.edu. And you can email me any questions about the content or suggestions, anything like that. All right, so what are we going to be covering? Drugs. We're going to be looking at pathophysiology and pharmacology. We're going to be looking at, obviously, the names of the drugs, classes, mechanism of action, and just building out stuff like that. So drugs have their own language, just like a lot of things within healthcare. So figuring out, separating them out by name and class, and then figuring out the mechanism of action and delving a little bit more into detail on that, and talking about what they're indicated for, safety, so side effects, drug interactions, and efficacy. If we're looking at 3 drugs in the same class, is one more effective than the other? So adverse drug events or reactions are going to be a big thing to talk about. Drug-drug interactions, clinical pearls are things that I'm going to come up with. We don't have enough time to cover everything, but we have enough time to cover some of the major points. So I'll try and focus on some of the more important aspects of certain medications as deemed by me and what I've experienced in my practice. And then disease state pearls and examples. Within the PA class, I do kind of go into discussing role of treatment. And within this course specifically, it sounds like Katrina is going to be taking a lot of that into in your primary care module. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that and using some disease state examples to illustrate some points here and there. For the most part, we're just going to be covering drugs. but I'll probably bleed that into, okay, so now we've talked about the drugs. How do we use these to treat a real disease? Okay, so what exactly is pharmacy as a discipline? I don't know how to do screen captures or show YouTube videos within recording a thing on PowerPoint, so sorry, I'm not that tech savvy yet. But there's a funny YouTube video. It's a Seinfeld clip, so if you're a Seinfeld fan, check it out, and I've got it there for you. But basically, pharmacy is a profession that involves drugs, and I think a lot of people think of a pharmacist as nothing more than somebody who works at like a Walgreens or a Target or whatever community pharmacy. And while that's a big part of our profession, while it's an important part of our profession, there's a lot more to pharmacy than that. So, what I'd encourage you to do is wherever you end up working in practice, develop a relationship with a pharmacist, whether it be one within your health system that you work in close proximity with, whether it be a community pharmacy that's close to your practice office that you send prescriptions to, and just foster that relationship. Pharmacists are great sources of drug information, and any pharmacist that's graduated within the last probably 20 years has a doctor of pharmacy, so they're very, very well educated. We have a lot of knowledge, and we know a lot more than just kind of the basics about drugs. We know quite a bit of detail about them as well. So I say we're nice and we like to help, and I think that's the case for a lot of pharmacists out there. So I think you'd be surprised if you asked a random pharmacist at any given community pharmacy a clinical question, the surprising answer you'd get, and you'd probably get a fairly engaged pharmacist who'd be willing to have a conversation with you. With that being said, though, there's a variety of training out there. For example, as a hospital pharmacist, a clinical pharmacist, I did a 1-year residency after my Doctor of Pharmacy program, which focused on clinical pharmacy and hospital pharmacy. And then some people go on to do things even further than that, specifically maybe with infectious disease, cardiology, or any types of specialty areas like that. Some will go on to do specific in training and administration. And then there's all kinds of different other fields too, like managed care, which is more like insurance side of things. There's pharmacists that are involved with industry as well. So it's really all over the place. So what exactly is pharmacy, and what's the science we're going to be talking about? Well, I think of it as 3-tiered. So the first step is medicinal chemistry. This is what's referred to as structure-activity relationships. So what a medicinal chemist does is they look at the structure of a molecule and think about it from the standpoint of how can that interact with different things in the body. So they may try and take, for example, maybe an endogenous substrate that works in a certain system in the body, and then they may make a synthetic molecule that mimics some of the qualities of that, but not all of them, so that it works maybe as a synthetic version of that product, or maybe it works against the endogenous mediator. Something like that. So that's the theory behind medicinal chemistry. It's sort of the early stages, and it's really very much chemistry and not as much medicine. We move into pharmacology, and what pharmacology is looking at those medicinal agents and figuring out what type of physiologic response they have. So, and this is where a lot of the discussion is going to be as far as when we talk about drugs, we're going to talk about what type of response they do, but even more importantly goes into pharmacotherapy, which puts it all together and says, okay, so this drug has this structure, this type of medicinal chemistry, and it works in this area of the body. And we know that the pharmacology of that means that we're going to get a certain response from that. So let's take a beta blocker, for example, which are used for blood pressure and to slow heart rate. Beta blocker designed to work on beta receptors, and it's designed to mimic endogenous substrates, except for the fact that instead of agonizing those receptors, it's antagonizing the receptors. And pharmacologically, we know that when we antagonize beta receptors, we get decreased heart rate and decreased blood pressure. So that's what we know from the first 2 steps. Now for pharmacotherapy, so where do we use that? So if we know we have a drug that lowers blood pressure and heart rate, is there some sort of disease state that could benefit from those 2 components to that medication? And there are several, but that's sort of the idea behind pharmacy as a whole. I'm going to focus a lot more on sort of the pharmacotherapy side of things. Pharmacology as a pure discipline is a term we throw around a lot, but pharmacotherapy is really going to be more of the meat and potatoes of what we're going to focus on in this course. So today I just want to talk about a couple background things. We're talking about a little bit of regulatory stuff, some basic pharmacoeconomics, talk about drug databases, information sources, and maybe some other random topics. So where do drugs come from? This is an interesting study that was done a little while ago, but I think it's still relevant today. And you can see the key down there and what the different numbers or what the different letters correspond to. And what you'll see is that most things out there have some sort of natural basis to their product. Now you see totally synthetic makes up a little less than a third. So there's a lot that are just purely synthetic agents too. But what we're having, but to remember that a lot of drugs do come from natural sources is something that I always keep in the back of my head, because that's really where not only drugs came from historically, but also where a lot of drugs are coming from in the future. We're still drug companies still tap into natural sources, natural plants and animal byproducts that might have some sort of pharmacologic benefit. Now, totally synthetic usually are drugs based off of something that was natural to begin with. So, like if you take fentanyl, for example, fentanyl is a totally synthetic opioid for pain management. If you compare that to a drug like morphine, which morphine is a naturally occurring compound that comes from opium, you have drugs that work essentially on the same system. It's just one is totally synthetically designed, but it's still designed to work in sort of a natural way. So you have a lot of different products out there, but it is interesting to know that a lot of drugs do come from sources. Here's just an example I have. This is a product called Byetta. It's used for diabetes, and it's derived from the venom of a Gila monster, Mexican beaded lizard. And there's lots of examples out there, but I like that one. So Big Pharma, I'm going to talk about them for a little bit because I think it's important to understand pharmacoeconomics and where drugs come from specifically. I know this can be kind of boring for some people, but I do think it's really important for anyone who's prescribing medications or dealing with medications to understand the financial impact of the medications they're prescribing. So a lot of people think of big pharma as the dark side of pharmacy and the dark side of healthcare. They're out to make profits and make money, and they're ruthless corporations and they have no heart. Blah blah blah. I don't think it's quite as bad as that, but we're going to talk about exactly what big pharma does and how they get drugs approved, and some of the challenges and also some of the benefits that they have as businesses. So this is from Medscape. Medscape publishes a list like this every year, and it's not the best list in the world because it's looking primarily at brand names of products. So what we aren't getting on here is generics. And if you looked at top prescription and sales, so that'd be the right-hand column, that would probably have a lot of different generics in it intermixed there. So keep that in mind. But when we break it down to brand name products, this is where we're getting. So we can see just some interesting facts here about what is selling in the current market. So you see Humira, which is a drug used for some immune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis. Abilify is an antipsychotic historically, but is now used a lot for adjunct and antidepressant. Sovaldi is a new drug for hepatitis C that's insanely expensive, and so it's been getting a lot of use, but it's not like a blood pressure medication where you have millions of people on it. You don't have a lot of people on Sovaldi. It's just super expensive. So it's kind of interesting to watch these trends every year and see where things can take place. I mean, you see some things on here like AAA is an HIV medication. Harvoni is a Hep C medication. So some of these new Hep C medications have just skyrocketed in the amount of cost. So you think about it from a total economic impact perspective. Harvoni didn't exist a year and a half ago. So that's $5 billion of money, healthcare dollars we're spending on Harvoni that we weren't spending a year and a half ago. Now, you could argue that the patients who are benefiting from that may have been on different therapies that were expensive too, or they may have been hospitalized for hepatitis complications, which could be more expensive too. So you take the benefit and outweigh the risk potentially by having something that's expensive, and hopefully you're eliminating healthcare costs down the road by paying up front for a drug like Harvoni, which is essentially a cure for hepatitis C. So how do drugs get to the market? A goal is to find a product that's safe and effective. So you start with preclinical testing, looking at lab animal, and maybe proposing some early human testing. And then once you have a product that seems like it might be beneficial, you file for an IND, which is an investigational new drug application, to the FDA. FDA approves that. You can go into phase 1 clinical trials. So phase one is what I think of as like if you're ever on the U of M campus or something, there's lots of research studies where they're looking for healthy male volunteers. So I think of college students as being kind of the primary target here. They pay them, not a ton of money, but they pay them some money to be part of this. And essentially what they're trying to figure out in phase one is simply side effects, safety, and kinetic information. So they take a group of, men in their late teens, early 20s, and these people, this population in general, is going to have very good kidney clearance. They're going to have very good liver function. So you're taking really the most metabolically active group of our population and giving them medications. So by doing that, you're seeing, okay, in a perfect picture, if everyone had these really well-functioning systems, how is the drug going to be processed? So then they'll give people the drug. They'll take urine samples, see if it's excreted. They can do blood tests to measure concentrations, and depending on what the drug is or how it's absorbed, they may do different things too. But you guys kind of get the picture. The other thing they're looking for early, which is sort of the ethical dilemma here, is the side effects and safety component. So as a young college student, do you really want to expose yourself to something that may potentially impact you further down the road? That's something you have to decide based on, I guess, the financial incentives for it and whether you think it's worth it or not. So if your phase one trials go well, if you have no apparent unacceptable toxicity and the kinetics look pretty good, obviously you don't want something that you're going to have to dose 8 times a day. That's not going to be a very effective product. So you want to make sure that all looks reasonable as well. Phase 2 trials are emphasis on efficacy. So now that we know our safety to a certain degree, we know the kinetics of the drug, we can move on to seeing, okay, does this drug actually work? So what phase 2 is you usually have a small group of people, 50 to 300, and these are people who have a certain disease or condition. So this is really a targeted market, and it's kind of like a trial run, if you want to think about it like that, where you're doing a dress rehearsal. You want to see if you can replicate good results in a small amount of people who have the disease that you're targeting with this medication. So small amount of people, if evidence of effectiveness is shown in these small groups of people, you can proceed to phase 3 clinical trials. So phase 3 is what you probably think based on the trend we've going in. This is a large scale study. So these are the studies that are designed to confirm phase 1 and phase 2 in a big pool of people. So in this studies, we want different population groups. So when you read about a big phase 3 study, you usually read things like multi-centered, multinational. So that's what we want. We want different countries in a lot of different areas with different population groups, so that you're eliminating any confounding variables by focusing your trial on just a select group of people. Different doses. So usually here we might expand and try maybe a high dose or a low dose regimen and see if there's any benefit to that. Different indications may be done, or subsets of indications, subsets of populations. So you may have like maybe you want to just do a subset trial in patients with renal failure, or maybe patients, I don't know, who have been on a different adjunct medication, something like that. You might try something like that. Head to head against other agents. Phase 3 trial might, it's let's say you have something that's your gold standard. So for example, warfarin is the gold standard anticoagulant for venous thromboembolism and AFib to reduce stroke risk. And recently there's been a bunch of new anticoagulants approved. These all went through phase 3 trials, and they can't just compare themselves to placebo, right? Because warfarin is the gold standard. So really you have to compare yourself to warfarin, or you're not going to succeed as a drug. No one's going to want to use your drug if you can't compare it to the current gold standard medication. And so that's what these drugs did. They went head to head against warfarin, and they want to prove themselves as non-inferior, and that's exactly what they did. These trials, depending on the disease, could have several hundred patients, or they could have 10,000 plus patients. It just really depends. So like a product that's targeting AFib patients, well, you can have a pool of potential AFib patients in the millions. A product targeting pulmonary hypertension or maybe a more rare disease state, you're looking at not that many people. So that can really depend on just purely the disease you're in question that you're targeting. It's also much more expensive to do these big trials. So the bigger the trial, the more expensive, but also the better the data, and you can detect smaller differences statistically with more people. Okay, so if your phase 3 trial goes well, you submit your new drug application to the FDA. The FDA then has 60 days to decide whether or not it can be reviewed based on the promise of a good outcome with the drug. And then they look at the completeness of the application. And then usually it's about 6 to 10 months once they get the NDA approved. So they can fast track things too. You'll hear about the FDA doing some fast tracking, and it depends on certain medications might be fast tracked here or there. But so like, for example, the Ebola scare that was recent, they can fast track certain things through. If there's like an investigational product that is showing promise, they could give that one fast track priority. There's also phase 4, and the phase 4 is post marketing. So at this point, the drug is on the market, and now patients and providers and you and me can report these things that we see to the FDA. So, for example, if we see if you work with a patient population that's using a new drug frequently, and you're seeing something over and over again, you can start reporting that to this MedWatch program, and I've got the link there for you. And what it is it's again, it's just a voluntary reporting program. And then if the FDA gets enough of reports of maybe a certain adverse reaction to a drug, they'll require the manufacturer to do some additional testing. They might add a black box warning to the medication. There's a number of things they could consider doing. All right, what if it's not a new drug? There's something called abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA. This is for approval of generics. And all generics really need to do is prove they're bioequivalent, meaning that they have the same kinetics and same bioavailability as the original product. You don't have to prove that your generic compound is as good clinically, because that compound has already gone through testing, and so it's already approved. So if your compound's exactly the same, which it should be, then you don't need to prove that. You just have to prove that it is the same and that it's bioequivalent. Also must be a reputable manufacturer. So if Chad wants to make a generic drug in his garage, that would not fly. So that's one thing to think about too. Every once in a while you hear about the FDA shutting down places around the world who are just not reputable manufacturers, but somehow they get into the market stream for whatever reason. Excuse me. Biosimilars are products that are designed to be generic kind of equivalent to biologic products. So biologic products are new, sort of a newer area within pharmacy, and these are products that are produced. They're usually large molecules, so they're peptides or proteins, enzymes, and they're very expensive to make because usually they're involving some sort of biological reaction. So maybe they're being made by PCR or some other system like that. But and they're injectable, so you can't make them in a tablet form. And so for a while, there hasn't been really a good pathway for generic manufacturers to make a biosimilar product, because there's no real way to prove that your product is exactly the same because it's a biologic. And there's a lot of legal red tape around this. And actually, the FDA approved a biosimilar recently because there was a law passed that they could make biosimilars. But that biosimilar product, even though it is available, it's under litigation right now. So who knows what will happen with biosimilars? It's kind of a nebulous area. But biologic products are really expensive. And so having a biosimilar that, even if it's 80% of the cost of the original product, will save us quite a bit of money. So if you look at a product like Humira, which was on the top of our list we just saw, if we have a biosimilar to that, that's $1 billion saved a year potentially, depending on how much they can get the cost down by. Over-the-counter products usually start as a prescription and then later are moved to OTC status. I'm talking about FDA-approved medications that are over-the-counter, so things like Tylenol, ibuprofen, aspirin. I'm not talking about herbal supplements or anything like that. But and we see this happen from time to time. Like most recently, you've seen the steroid nasal sprays like Flonase and some other medications like that go over the counter. You've seen a lot of the allergy medications like Claritin and Zyrtec and Allegra go over the counter. You've seen the PPIs go over the counter, so Prilosec and Prevacid, and I'm probably missing one here, but you guys get the point. You'll see these drugs that are considered to be relatively safe and widely used to go to over-the-counter status over time. Vitamin supplements, natural products. I think Katrina's going to do the lecture on this at some point, but I just want to point out the FDA has essentially no regulatory authority. If they find out people are making a really bad product, they can step in and say, okay, we're going to shut you down unless you fix this. Or if they find out they're breaking the law, like there's a couple products out there that have maybe been marketed as a natural supplement, but really they're technically more like a drug. And then the FDA does have some authority to come in and say, okay, fix this, or you're going to be out of business shortly. So again, that'll be discussed during a later lecture for you guys. This is a quote from when I was in school, and I just think it's kind of funny to leave it here. So by the year 2015, prescription drugs are estimated to cost $780 billion per year in the U.S. alone. Figure is 4% of the total U.S. economy and 20% of healthcare expenditures. This was an estimated model when I was in school a few years ago, and obviously it's 2015 right now. 2016 soon. I'm recording this before you guys start class, so 2015 for me, but you'll be watching this in 2016. But the point of this is that we spend a lot of money on prescription drugs in the United States, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just is what it is. So 4% of the U.S. economy and 20% of all health care dollars go to prescription drugs. That's a huge amount of money. So that's why the pharmacoeconomic impact of prescribing medications is so important. And that's why throughout this course, I'm going to be talking about why we pick certain drugs over another. A lot of it has to do with cost. And if something's more expensive and it's not any better than a less expensive equivalent, there's no point in using it. And that's something we have to drive home a lot to providers. As a pharmacist, something I have to drive home a lot, that we don't use that drug. Why? Well, it's good. It just is too expensive. And this one works just as well and it's less expensive. So it's kind of a no-brainer. Some situations, it's not as simple as that, but there's a lot of, you'd be surprised at how often we see these really new expensive drugs being prescribed when there really isn't a good reason for it. Okay, so with making a drug, it's expensive, and that's the bottom line here. The average drug costs about $4 billion to bring to market, if not higher than that. I've read estimates anywhere up to $10 billion. 1 in 10 products that a company invests into will actually make it to the market. So it's a really high failure rate. And that could be because the product's not effective. The FDA might not approve it because it's got maybe some safety issues. Who knows? The U.S. Also has an interesting dilemma, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, but let me talk about this chart here really quick before I talk about some of those other bullet points here. When you have drugs being made, you have a bunch of different major companies here, and you can see that, like, for example, AstraZeneca has approved 5 drugs, and this is a little bit old data now, but and you can see their total R&D spending and the per drug spending. So you can see who's really getting the most drugs approved at the most efficient rates here. So it shows you that you can be a little bit leaner if you want, but it depends also on the product you're making, the size of the clinical trial you're investing in. And what's really devastating to companies is if they come out with this drug, let's say they spend $4 billion on a drug, they come out and people are like, well, I don't know if we really want to use it yet. Maybe we'll just keep using the old standard, and then we'll see if some of our patients qualify for your drug, we might consider using it. Or insurance may not pay for it because it's a new drug, it's expensive. They want to pay for the old equivalent drug unless you can prove that the patient needs this new equivalent. A big area of problem with this, and we're talking about this a little bit during infectious disease, with antibiotics, because there are so many antibiotics on the market, and we have a lot of old antibiotics that work just fine. It's just there are some really resistant infections that we're seeing, and there just isn't any money to be made in treating really resistant infections because no one's going to use your drug very often. So if you spend $4 billion on a brand new antibiotic that's this interesting new novel mechanism that works on very resistant, hard to treat strains, that's great, but your company's not going to sell a lot of that product just because it's not a common indication. So from that standpoint, sometimes you'll see the government supplementing or infusing cash into these companies to say, hey, we need these drugs, we need these new antibiotics to be developed, so we're going to give you some money to help offset your costs because we know we probably won't make a ton of money off of it. A couple other points really quick. The U.S. pricing bubble is a bullet point I put on here just for interest and conversation. When you're having medications being marketed worldwide, almost every country in the world has caps on how much drugs can cost. So if you're buying one drug in Germany, it's probably going to cost a lot less than if you're buying it in the United States. The United States has no laws like that. So what happens is drug companies jack up their prices in the US to try and make up for the fact that they can't do that in other countries. So here in the United States, we have much more expensive drugs than other places in the world. Now, not to say that drugs are super cheap other places, but we have no regulation really around that. So that's one thing that's a little bit interesting about the United States and our drug pricing. Direct-to-consumer advertising, I believe Katrina has a point on this in her lecture, so I'm not really going to go into it. I think we've all seen these, and some of the commercials are kind of funny, but I'll point them out as we go through. And sustainability, this is not a sustainable system. This is extremely expensive. Drug companies make a lot of money and profit, but they also they're forced to reinvest a lot of it into their company because they have to sustain these massive R&D costs and these massive failures that they're having. So yes, are they greedy corporate companies? Maybe, maybe not. But really, it is an expensive process to make medications and do them safely and do it effectively and do it correctly. And it's something that is really, it's a hard process to sustain. So that's why there aren't, we see some of the big pharmaceutical companies out there, they've sustained themselves for a while. But the question is, unless they can adapt to new trends in the market, are they going to be able to sustain these failures and these rising drug costs? And, only time will tell what'll happen with that. Okay, so for researching a new drug, what's on the new horizon? Genomics is a big thing. So genomics can be done to identify new drug targets. We can create magic bullets, so to speak. So if we know that there's a specific gene that's expressed in certain cancer patients, we can maybe target that. You can use advanced modeling techniques like X-ray crystallography and computer modeling to try and figure out if you can develop a specific structure that's going to fit in a specific site that's going to be much more selective than what we have already. Looking at large databases of information, screening people with diseases to see, let's look at everyone with hypertension and see if any of them are on an antidepressant and if that has any benefits. So you see stuff like that used where people will look for a secondary indication for one of their medications. Biologics versus small molecule drugs. So I talked a little bit about biologics, and we'll talk about those throughout the course, but biologics are getting much more popular, and that's really a lot of the future of where we're seeing medications. Small molecule drugs, the typical tablets people take, not a lot in the pipeline right now. The Me Too pitfall is a problem we see where we see a new drug approved, but it's really what we call a Me Too drug, meaning it's just the same as what's already out there. It's a new product, might have a little bit different kinetics, but essentially there's not much difference in it. It's in the same class as 3 other drugs on the market, so who really cares? More active enantiomers is something you see a lot where a product will go generic and then the drug company comes out with the active enantiomer of that product and gets a new patent on that. And then orphan drugs. Orphan drugs are for diseases that don't have research dollars behind them. So we see orphan drug status approved for various products, and that's something that you may encounter, but likely not. So how does this affect you? Well, there's a few things we're going to talk about here, and all of these affect you as a prescriber. Generic substitution. Anytime you write for a medication, a pharmacy can legally substitute a generic product unless you prescribe it DAW, dispense as written. I highly discourage you from prescribing DAW unless you really feel the need to or the patient is adamant about it. It's just there's not really much reason to prescribe a brand name over a generic anymore. It just really isn't. Generic products are chemically identical. Remember, they have to prove bioequivalence, and they are the exact same drug substrate. Now, the excipient ingredients, so these are like the things so a tablet consists of maybe lactose and some other drugs, some other compounds that aren't pharmacologically active, and then of course the active compound. So the excipient ingredients are different from a generic manufacturer and the brand manufacturer. But what's the same is the chemical entity. They're much less expensive, but just know that when something goes generic right away, it takes a while to see the cost savings. Usually what happens is that the generic or the brand manufacturer gets a non-compete clause, and a lot of brand manufacturers own their own generic subsidiaries. So like Pfizer owns a company called Greenstone, which makes generics. So if a Pfizer product goes generic, they'll send all their product to Greenstone. Greenstone will relabel that as a generic. It's still going to be pretty expensive, But once that gets out of that non-compete area, then all these generic manufacturers can pick it up, and you're going to see the costs go down substantially. Using a brand name versus generic name and speaking, I'll give you both, and I'll tell you both. It depends on what area you work in. Some areas they love brand names. Some areas of medicine they speak in generic names. Some drugs we like to use the brand name of. Just depends really. So I'll try and give you both, and really you should know both as a provider. All right, so why doesn't insurance cover something? Insurance companies have specific formularies. They represent preferred medication lists and are in tiers. So usually the higher tier, the higher the copay. So a new non-generic product that just hit the market, probably going to be a higher tier, higher copay. An old generic product, lowest tier possible because it's cheap. They may exclude certain drugs. So if something may be off formulary altogether if it's not considered to be as effective or cost effective as other medications. They always give preference to generics. And a prior authorization is something you may encounter. And this is where you want to prescribe something that's non-formulary. The insurance company comes back and says, you have to prove that this patient needs this product. And so you might have to show evidence that they failed certain therapies before you can go to the therapy you would like to prescribe. So pharmacy pricing and reimbursement, it all has to do insurance and the cost of the product, and then the pharmacy bills for their time too. So for example, even if you filled an empty vial of pills, so if you just sent through a label and had a pharmacist check a prescription and didn't even put any product in it, it's probably going to cost the pharmacy around $10 to $12 to do that. And that's labor, and that involves the pharmacist's time, the technician time. The pharmacist is checking drug interactions when they dispense product. They're checking your profile to make sure that it's not the same as something you already have. They're doing a lot of work behind the scenes, and so that does cost money. So even if you see something really inexpensive, like ibuprofen tablets, it'll still cost $10 to $12 to get that filled. Now, in big box retails and some of the big box chains out there, they have the $4 generic or the low-cost generic options. That's because they have such high volume, they can afford to do that. Anybody who dispenses a $4 generic is losing money every time they do that because it costs more money than that for the pharmacist to spend, a few minutes looking at the product than it does to actually spend the $4 on it. So it's kind of an interesting thing that's unfortunately hurt a lot of independent pharmacies and smaller pharmacies because they really can't compete with a $4 generic because they lose money on that. Here's a great quote from one of my professors in pharmacy school. A drug that one cannot afford is neither safe nor effective. So pharmaceutical cost is high. Make sure that you are prescribing medications your patient can afford. If they can't afford the medication, they aren't going to pick it up. They aren't going to take it. Therefore, it's not going to be effective. So in that case, be wise about how you're prescribing and be a good steward of pharmacy and healthcare resources. Just some final quick things. Controlled substances. We're going to talk about these here and there, but these should be things you're very familiar with. You should know prescribing differences with controlled substance. There's no refills available for C2 products. 6 months worth of refills only for C3 to C5 products. The Minnesota Prescription Monitoring Program, I put the link there for you. Something you guys should all have access to. This is a very good tool to see if you have a patient in your office who's asking for pain medications and you're maybe concerned that they're filling at other doctors or they're, we use the term doctor, pharmacy shoppers or doctor shoppers, and they people who go around and try and get narcotics, maybe because they're addicted, which in that case they need medical help, or maybe because they're trying to sell them, and in that case that's a crime, obviously. Either way, it's kind of a crime. So be careful and just be mindful of that. You are ultimately on the hook as a provider. Providers have been prosecuted. I don't think in Minnesota, but there's been some states and examples of providers and pharmacists being prosecuted for negligence as far as prescribing medications to people that they didn't, and basically not doing their due diligence to know that that patient was addicted or selling the medication. You also have drug shortages, something I want to talk about. Drug shortages happen all the time. It's sort of something that's come about within the last 5 years of pharmacy. And products tend to go on and off shortage often. So if you don't be surprised if you get a call from somebody saying, sorry, we can't prescribe this, it's on shortage. That's really all you really need to know about that. And then hopefully you can work with the pharmacist to decide an appropriate alternative. Like at our hospital, if we have a really popular medication that goes on shortage, we'll have some sort of a contingency plan that allows us to automatically substitute some sort of equivalent product. Hopefully there is one. And also implications economically can be really substantial. For example, if something goes on shortage, and let's say maybe one manufacturer has made doxycycline an antibiotic for years and years and years, and they decide, you know what, we aren't making a lot of money on doxycycline, so we're just going to stop. What happens is then another manufacturer can come in and say, hey, I'm going to make doxycycline now, and I'm going to charge 20 times the amount, which is what we saw. I don't know if you guys have seen the news of that guy Shrick Kelly or whatever his name is. I saw it all over. It seems like everyone seems to hate this guy, but this guy essentially did that exact same thing with one of his pharmacy companies. That often actually does happen in real life. I think this guy just happened to be the unlucky one where he got all the negative press, but there's been plenty of other companies that have done exactly what he's done. Online pharmacies, I don't recommend these ever for any reason whatsoever, unless they're affiliated with a real pharmacy. So like CVS and Walgreens and stuff like that, they might have an online system where you can get mail order or refills or whatever. That's fine. What I'm talking about is online pharmacies from other countries or places where you can get things without prescriptions. If your patients are using these, they probably aren't getting real product, and who knows what they're taking. I had a professor at Bethel who, before he came to Bethel, he worked at Pfizer, and one of his jobs was to test different counterfeit Lipitor products coming into the United States from other countries, and to see what they had in them. And he said it was really interesting what he would find. Some of them actually did have Lipitor in them. Other ones had totally different things. So you could get a really adulterated and possibly a dangerous product. So I really don't recommend online pharmacies at all. Then there's the term behind the counter status. Behind the counter would apply really to not much right now. Sudafed's probably the only thing where you actually have to show ID before you buy it. There's been talk of having birth control be behind the counter, where a pharmacist could go through a questionnaire with a patient and decide if they're appropriate for that. There's been talk about hypertension management. There's all kinds of things that could potentially be behind the counter, but a lot of that hinders on how much leeway we as a healthcare system want to give pharmacists as far as being providers. Pharmacists aren't recognized as providers right now. There's a lot of legal advocacy efforts going on to change that, but for now, behind the counter is kind of a term that's not really applicable. So don't worry too much about that. All right, drug references. Depending on what you use and what you like, you'll find your own system here. I encourage you to explore whatever library you use within your health system. So if you're affiliated with Alina, we have plenty of things. All health systems are going to have quite a bit. If you aren't really affiliated with a health system, you may be on your own. In that case, consider buying a subscription to a database because it's going to come in handy. Personally, I love UpToDate. I think a lot of people love UpToDate. UpToDate is kind of like a Wikipedia of healthcare. You can type in whatever disease you want, and it gives you relatively current summary of information. It's not always 100% accurate, and oftentimes it's opinion. There's authors that are writing these articles, so they'll say, we recommend this or blah, 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 but it's a pretty good source, and it's a great starting point. UpToDate is also linked directly to LexiComp, which is a drug database and is a very valid drug database as well. So that's a good resource. Micromedics is a drug database that is a little bit hard to use, I think, for non-pharmacists. I think it's not as user-friendly. So I don't necessarily recommend that. But if you like it or play around with it, it does have a lot of information in it. Sanford Guide, if you're a nurse, if you've used Micromedics in your nursing practice before, you've probably used it for IV compatibility. So it's got some nice functionality there. Sanford Guide is a good reference for antibiotic therapy and antimicrobial therapy. It'll show you spectrums of activity. I'm going to show you some Sanford. We'll talk about Sanford a little bit more during our antibiotic lecture. There's other things I've listed on here. Popular things people like are Epocrates. I don't like Epocrates because for me it doesn't give me enough information. But if you just want the bare minimum of like what a drug is, what's it used for, what are the common doses, it's pretty good. And I think it's free, at least the basic version's free. So, and it's an app. You can get it on any device, Android or Apple or whatever you have. So a lot of people like Epocrates. Personally, again, for me, I want more detail, but it's okay for the basic information. And obviously there's other things too, guidelines, PubMed, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever you want to use, it's up to you. But we'll walk through a couple different things if I'm talking about a specific set of guidelines or a specific resource I use in certain areas. Okay, so that's it for my lecture today. Once again, petcha@bethel.edu is my email if you have any questions or comments. And then we'll keep going and do some different lectures throughout the course. You're going to get a few lectures from me right away, specifically within infectious disease and some other topics. I'm going to do a little bit on immunizations, and then a little bit of a break, and then I'll be rounding out the second part of the semester with several lectures in cardiology and mental health, neurology, and pain management, some other things like that. So with that being said, hopefully this was helpful for you. And again, any feedback, let me know, and I'll I guess I won't see you guys again, but I'll be speaking to you again soon here. So enjoy your week and have a good day. Thanks. Bye.